What if the voice you hear in your head is not thinking itself, but just one way the mind sometimes explains what it is already doing? Do your thoughts speak in full sentences, or do they appear as images, feelings, and quiet certainty? And have you ever noticed how rarely you question that difference? If some people move through life without an inner narrator at all, yet still reason, feel, and decide with clarity, what does that say about consciousness and the way awareness actually works? This explores the psychology of people who don't have an inner monologue, how thought continues without words, and why silence inside the mind does not mean emptiness. If this kind of slow, honest examination of the mind speaks to you, subscribe to the channel and continue the journey with us. Chapter 1: The Quiet Inside. These are the foundations of how inner speech works and why some people do not experience it. And this chapter explains what psychologists know, what remains uncertain, and why internal silence is a legitimate form of conscious experience rather than a defect. Inner speech refers to the experience of hearing words in one's mind without speaking aloud, commonly described as an internal voice that narrates thoughts, reactions, plans, or memories. In psychology and cognitive science, this phenomenon is also called internal monologue, or verbal thought. Although researchers agree, these labels oversimplify a wide range of internal experiences. The premise of this chapter is simple and direct. Inner speech is not universal, not constant, and not necessary for thinking, even though many people intuitively assume it defines consciousness itself. Research across psychology suggests that inner speech exists on a spectrum rather than as a binary presence or absence. Some individuals report frequent, detailed verbal narration throughout most of their waking hours, while others experience inner speech only in specific contexts, such as reading, planning, or mentally rehearsing conversations. A smaller group report little to no spontaneous verbal thought, describing their inner experience as quiet, image-based, sensory, or conceptual rather than linguistic. Estimates of how common each pattern is vary widely, depending on method, population, and definitions, and exact percentages remain uncertain due to reliance on self-report and introspection, unverified. One of the most persistent misconceptions is the idea that a lack of inner monologue implies a lack of awareness, intelligence, or reflective capacity. Cognitive neuroscience contradicts this assumption. Many essential mental processes operate without language, including visual perception, spatial reasoning, emotional appraisal, motor planning, and pattern recognition. These processes occur rapidly and often automatically, long before words could be formed, which means that verbal narration is not the foundation of thought, but one possible overlay added after the fact. Language itself is a relatively late evolutionary development compared to perception and emotion, and this has implications for how the mind works. Human brains evolved to interpret sensory information, detect threats, navigate environments, and coordinate movement long before spoken language existed. Inner speech appears to be a secondary adaptation that leverages existing neural systems rather than the core engine of cognition. This helps explain why thinking can continue smoothly even when verbal thought is reduced, interrupted, or absent. Psychologists distinguish between spontaneous inner speech, which arises without deliberate effort, and elicited or task-related inner speech, which appears when someone is asked to think verbally or perform a language-based task. This distinction matters because many people who report having no inner monologue can still produce inner speech when required. such as silently reading a sentence or mentally rehearsing a phrase. The presence of elicited inner speech does not necessarily indicate that verbal narration is the person's default mode of thinking, and confusing these two forms has contributed to misunderstanding in both research and public discussion. Another important clarification concerns the subjective nature of reporting inner experience. Inner speech cannot be observed directly, measured with instruments, or recorded externally, which means researchers rely heavily on introspection and self-description. Decades of psychological research show that people are often unreliable narrators of their own mental processes, especially for routine or automatic experiences. Individuals tend to notice unusual or emotionally charged thoughts more than ordinary ones, and beliefs about how thinking is supposed to work can shape how people describe what they experience. This limitation applies equally to people who report constant inner speech and those who report none. Despite these challenges, multiple research traditions converge on the conclusion that internal silence is not rare in the sense of being pathological. People who describe minimal or absent inner speech still demonstrate intact reasoning, memory, emotional understanding, and decision-making. They often report knowing what they think or feel without needing to verbalize it internally, accessing information as impressions, images, spatial relationships, or abstract concepts. These descriptions align with what cognitive science already knows about nonverbal thought, even though the subjective experience can be difficult for verbal thinkers to imagine. The difficulty of imagining thought without words says more about the limits of introspection than about the limits of cognition. For someone whose mind frequently narrates experience, inner speech feels inseparable from awareness itself, which can make its absence seem impossible or even unsettling. Yet this intuition does not reflect how cognition actually functions. Awareness can exist without commentary, and many forms of conscious experience unfold without being translated into language, unless there is a reason to do so. Developmental psychology offers additional context. Children acquire spoken language gradually, yet they think, feel, plan, and solve problems long before they can articulate thoughts verbally. Early cognition relies heavily on perception, emotion, and action rather than language, which suggests that verbal thought is layered onto pre-existing mental capacities rather than replacing them. This developmental trajectory supports the idea that some adults may continue to rely more heavily on nonverbal modes of thought without any loss of cognitive richness. It is also important to distinguish between silence and emptiness. Reports of internal quiet do not describe a blank or inactive mind, but a different mode of organization. Information may be present as mental images, bodily sensations, emotional tones, or structured knowledge without words attached. Decisions can emerge as a sense of direction rather than a verbal debate, and understanding can appear as recognition rather than explanation. These forms of knowing are harder to describe precisely because language is not their native format, but they are no less real or functional. Cultural assumptions play a role in how inner speech is interpreted. Many modern societies place heavy emphasis on verbal reasoning, self-explanation, and articulate self-awareness, which can lead to the belief that thinking itself must be verbal. Educational systems often encourage talking through problems, explaining reasoning step by step, and narrating one's thought process. While these strategies are effective for many people, they can obscure the fact that reasoning can occur without internal narration, particularly for tasks involving visual, spatial, or intuitive processing. At the same time, researchers caution against romanticizing internal silence or framing it as superior. The goal of understanding inner speech is not to rank cognitive styles, but to recognize diversity. Inner speech can support planning, self-regulation, memory, and social reasoning, and many people rely on it heavily. Others achieve the same outcomes through different internal mechanisms. The existence of multiple pathways to effective cognition reflects flexibility rather than deficiency. The beginning of any serious discussion about people who do not have an inner monologue requires letting go of the assumption that one internal experience defines all minds. Consciousness does not operate according to a single template, and verbal narration is only one way the brain organizes awareness. Internal quiet is not a void, not a malfunction, and not a sign of reduced depth. It is simply one position on a broad spectrum of how human minds can work. This chapter establishes the baseline for the rest of the discussion. Inner speech is real, common, and influential, but it is neither universal nor foundational to thought itself. Some people live with a constant internal voice, others with intermittent narration, and others with a mind that operates largely without words. All of these patterns fall within the range of normal human cognition, and understanding that range is the first step toward understanding what inner silence actually represents. Chapter 2. Thinking without words. These are the mechanisms that allow thinking to occur without an inner monologue. And this chapter explains how nonverbal cognition works, how information is represented without language, and why verbal thought is only one of several possible mental formats. Thinking without words sounds paradoxical to people whose minds rely heavily on internal narration. Yet psychology and neuroscience have long shown that cognition does not depend on language. The premise of this chapter is direct. When inner speech is absent or minimal, thought does not disappear. It simply operates through different representational systems that do not require verbal labeling. Cognitive science describes thought as the manipulation of mental representations, not sentences. These representations can take many forms, including visual images, spatial maps, emotional signals, bodily sensations, and abstract structures that are not consciously verbalized. For people without a persistent inner monologue, these nonverbal formats often serve as the primary medium of reasoning. Information is still present and accessible, but it is experienced as knowing rather than as something spoken internally. Visual thinking provides one of the clearest examples. Many individuals report that ideas appear as images, scenes, diagrams, or spatial arrangements rather than words. Problems can be solved by mentally rotating shapes, comparing patterns, or noticing relationships without translating them into sentences. Research in cognitive psychology has consistently demonstrated that visual spatial reasoning can function independently of language, as seen in tasks involving mental rotation, navigation, and object recognition, although the exact neural mechanisms vary across individuals. Spatial representation extends beyond imagery into a broader sense of structure. Some people describe thoughts as positions, distances, or movements within an internal space, where relationships matter more than labels. A plan may appear as a sequence of locations or steps arranged spatially rather than verbally explained. This mode of thinking allows complex organization without narration, relying instead on pattern alignment and relational awareness. Emotional and bodily signals also play a central role in nonverbal cognition. Decisions are often guided by felt responses that arise before conscious reasoning occurs. Neuroscience research on affective processing shows that emotional evaluation happens rapidly and automatically, influencing judgment and behavior without requiring words. For individuals without inner speech, these signals may remain largely untranslated, yet they still inform choices, priorities, and reactions with precision. Another form of nonverbal thought involves abstract conceptual knowing. People frequently report that they understand something without being able to put it into words immediately. This phenomenon is not limited to those without inner monologues, but it becomes more visible in their descriptions. Knowledge exists as a structured sense of meaning that can later be verbalized if needed, rather than as a sentence already formed in the mind. The understanding precedes the explanation, not the other way around. Memory retrieval offers a useful illustration. When recalling an event, some people experience a verbal recounting of what happened, while others access the memory as a scene, a feeling, or a sequence of actions. The absence of internal narration does not prevent recall. It changes the format in which the memory appears. Cognitive models of memory distinguish between declarative content and the subjective experience of remembering, supporting the idea that language is optional rather than required. The speed of nonverbal thought is another defining feature. Many cognitive operations occur faster than language can keep up, which becomes especially apparent in activities like sports, music, or skilled manual tasks. Athletes, musicians, and craftspeople often report entering states where action flows without verbal instruction. Movements are guided by perception and feedback rather than internal commentary, demonstrating that effective control does not require inner speech. Decision-making without words often feels intuitive rather than analytical, but intuition should not be confused with randomness. Psychological research describes intuition as the rapid integration of past experience, pattern recognition, and emotional evaluation. For people without inner monologues, decisions may emerge as a clear sense of direction or certainty without an accompanying verbal rationale. The reasoning still exists, but it operates beneath the level of conscious narration. One common misconception is that nonverbal thinkers cannot reflect on their thoughts. Reflection simply occurs differently. Instead of replaying conversations internally or narrating motives, reflection may involve revisiting images, sensations, or outcomes, and noticing how they align. Insight can arise through comparison rather than explanation, and self-awareness can be grounded in recognition rather than commentary. Language still plays a role, but it is often externalized rather than internalized. People without inner speech typically use language effectively when speaking or writing, constructing sentences in real time rather than pre-hearing them internally. Words are generated as needed for communication, not as a constant background process. This distinction helps explain why the absence of inner monologue does not impair verbal ability. Educational and professional environments sometimes mistake verbal fluency for thought itself. Tasks that require explaining reasoning step by step can disadvantage nonverbal thinkers, not because they lack understanding, but because translation into language adds an extra layer of effort. The underlying cognition remains intact, but its preferred format does not match the task's demands. This mismatch can lead to incorrect assumptions about competence or depth. Neuroscience supports the existence of multiple cognitive pathways. Brain imaging studies show that different tasks activate different networks depending on whether processing is verbal, visual, or sensory. although interpretations of these findings remain limited by current methods, unverified. What is clear is that no single network governs all thinking, reinforcing the idea that inner speech is one option among many rather than a central control system. Importantly, thinking without words is not constant silence. Minds shift between modes depending on context. Even people who report little spontaneous inner speech may experience brief verbalization during complex planning or social rehearsal, while people with constant narration may enter wordless states during absorption or flow. Cognitive style reflects tendency, not rigid categorization. The persistence of the belief that thinking requires words says more about cultural habits than about cognition itself. Modern societies prioritize verbal explanation, debate, and self-description, which elevates inner speech as a marker of intelligence or awareness. These values shape expectations, making non-verbal cognition harder to recognize and easier to misunderstand. Understanding non-verbal thought requires letting go of the assumption that language equals clarity. Clarity can exist without sentences, and confusion can exist despite them. What matters is functional outcome, not format. People who think without an inner monologue plan decide, create, and understand using systems that evolved long before language and continue to operate alongside it. This chapter builds on the foundation established earlier. If inner speech is not universal, then cognition must have alternative roots, and those roots are not inferior or incomplete. Thinking without words relies on images, structures, sensations, emotions, and abstract knowing, all of which can carry meaning with precision and depth. Recognizing these mechanisms helps explain how internal silence can coexist with fully intact, and often highly efficient, mental life. Chapter 3: How the Brain Organizes Silent Thought. These are the neural and cognitive systems that support thinking without an inner monologue. And this chapter explains how the brain represents information without words, how silent cognition is organized, and what neuroscience can and cannot currently confirm. The absence of inner speech does not imply a lack of structure in the brain. Silent thought still relies on organized neural activity, distributed across systems that evolved to process perception, action, memory, and emotion. The premise of this chapter is clear. When verbal narration is minimal or absent, the brain does not operate less. It operates differently, relying on non-linguistic networks that are already fundamental to human cognition. Neuroscience does not locate thought in a single brain region, and this becomes especially important when discussing inner speech. Language-related processes often involve areas such as the left inferior frontal gyrus and temporal regions associated with speech perception. But these regions are not active during all forms of thinking. Studies using brain imaging show that many cognitive tasks engage networks unrelated to language, particularly those involving vision, spatial reasoning, motor planning, and emotional evaluation, although precise interpretations remain limited by current methods, unverified. Visual processing networks provide a clear example of how information can be represented without words. The brain's visual pathways are capable of constructing detailed internal models of objects, scenes, and motion, even in the absence of external input. For individuals who rely on visual thinking, these networks can support planning, problem-solving, and memory without translation into language. A solution can appear as a spatial arrangement or transformation rather than a verbal explanation, and cognition proceeds without internal narration. Spatial cognition extends beyond imagery into systems responsible for orientation, mapping, and relational awareness. Regions associated with navigation and spatial memory allow the brain to track position, distance, and sequence. Thought organized in this way may feel like movement through an internal space rather than a sequence of sentences. Plans can exist as paths or configurations, and understanding emerges through alignment rather than verbal logic. Motor systems also contribute to silent cognition. Even when no movement occurs, the brain simulates actions internally, using networks involved in planning and execution. This internal simulation allows people to anticipate outcomes, rehearse behaviors, and make decisions without speaking internally. For someone without an inner monologue, action-oriented thinking may dominate, with decisions guided by readiness and coordination rather than internal dialogue. Emotional processing plays a central organizing role as well. Brain systems involved in effective evaluation assign value, relevance, and urgency to experiences, often before conscious awareness. These signals influence attention and choice without requiring verbal interpretation. Silent thinkers may rely more heavily on these effective cues, experiencing decisions as feelings of rightness, tension, or clarity rather than articulated reasons. The reasoning exists, but it is encoded in bodily and emotional terms. Memory systems further illustrate how cognition can function without words. Episodic memory often involves sensory and emotional reconstruction rather than verbal replay. A remembered event may surface as a visual scene, a bodily sensation, or a mood shift. Semantic memory, which stores knowledge about the world, does not inherently require language either. Facts and concepts can be accessed as recognition or familiarity, with words applied only when communication is necessary. One important distinction in neuroscience is between conscious access and underlying processing. Much of what the brain does never enters awareness in verbal form. Attention selects certain representations for conscious access, but consciousness itself does not demand linguistic formatting. Silent cognition reflects this reality by allowing awareness to track nonverbal representations directly, without converting them into speech-like form. Brain network models support this view. Cognitive functions emerge from interactions among multiple systems rather than a central command structure. Language networks represent one specialized subsystem among many. When inner speech is prominent, these networks interact strongly with others, shaping conscious experience. When inner speech is minimal, other systems take precedence, and awareness reflects their formats instead. The brain does not lose capacity, it shifts emphasis. Importantly, neuroscience does not currently provide a definitive neural signature that distinguishes people with inner monologues from those without. Most findings rely on task-based experiments that elicit language use, which biases results toward verbal processing. Resting state brain activity offers some insights into individual differences, but conclusions remain tentative and should not be overstated, unverified. The absence of a clear marker does not negate subjective reports. It highlights the limits of current tools. Neural efficiency may also play a role. Verbal narration introduces an additional processing step, translating experience into language. In some contexts, skipping this step may allow faster or more fluid cognition. This does not mean silent thinkers are universally faster or better, but it suggests that different neural strategies can reach similar outcomes through different routes. Efficiency depends on task demands, not on the presence of words. Social cognition offers another perspective. Understanding others often relies on reading facial expressions, tone, and context, rather than internal verbal analysis. These skills engage neural systems specialized for perception and emotion. People without strong inner monologues can still interpret social situations accurately, sometimes relying more on immediate perceptual cues than on internal commentary. Awareness remains outwardly oriented rather than inwardly narrated. The brain's adaptability is central to this discussion. Neural plasticity allows individuals to develop cognitive styles that suit their environments and demands. If a person consistently relies on nonverbal processing, those pathways become more efficient over time. Inner speech may remain available but unused, much like a tool that is functional but rarely needed. Cognitive diversity reflects adaptation, not deficit. Misinterpretations often arise when verbal report is treated as the gold standard of thought. Neuroscience reminds us that reportability and cognition are not the same. The brain can know, decide, and act without generating a sentence about it. Silent thinkers are not missing content. They are missing narration. The difference matters because narration is a layer, not the structure beneath it. The idea that awareness must be verbal persists largely because language dominates communication. People describe minds using words, which biases descriptions toward verbal formats. Silent cognition resists easy explanation, not because it lacks structure, but because its structure is not linguistic. Neuroscience supports the existence of these nonverbal structures, even if it cannot yet map them with precision. This chapter clarifies a critical point in the overall argument. The brain does not require inner speech to organize thought, maintain coherence, or support intelligence. Multiple neural systems already handle perception, memory, emotion, and action without language. When inner monologue is absent, these systems continue to function, often taking a more direct role in conscious awareness. Understanding how the brain supports silent thought helps dissolve the assumption that words are the backbone of the mind. Inner speech is one expression of neural coordination, not its source. Cognitive life continues with or without narration, structured by networks that evolved to operate long before language, and that remain fully capable of sustaining complex, meaningful thought. Chapter 4. Why inner monologues differ between people. These are the reasons inner speech varies so widely across individuals, and this chapter explains how development, learning, attention, and cognitive style shape whether an inner monologue becomes central, occasional, or largely absent. Differences in inner speech do not arise from a single cause. Psychology treats inner monologue as a learned and reinforced habit, rather than a built-in feature that appears uniformly in all minds. The core premise of this chapter is that variation in inner speech reflects differences in how people learn to regulate attention, solve problems, and interpret their own mental activity over time. Developmental experience plays a major role. Inner speech is closely tied to external speech during childhood, where spoken language is first used to guide behavior, regulate emotion, and solve problems aloud. Over time, this external speech often becomes internalized, forming what many adults experience as an inner voice. However, internalization does not occur in the same way or to the same degree for everyone. Some individuals rely less on verbal self-guidance and more on direct perception, action, or emotional feedback, which reduces the need for ongoing internal narration. Educational environments can reinforce these differences. School systems often emphasize verbal explanation, step-by-step reasoning, and narrated problem-solving. Students who succeed using these strategies may strengthen inner speech through repeated use. Others may reach the same outcomes through visual reasoning, pattern recognition, or intuitive understanding, even if those strategies receive less explicit recognition. Over time, the strategies that feel most efficient tend to dominate, shaping whether inner speech becomes habitual or peripheral. Attention style also influences inner monologue frequency. People differ in how attention is allocated between internal and external information. Some individuals naturally focus inward, monitoring thoughts and reactions closely, which supports continuous narration. Others orient attention outward, tracking sensory input and environmental changes more strongly. For these individuals, verbal commentary may feel unnecessary or even distracting, and awareness remains anchored to perception rather than narration. Cognitive load further affects whether inner speech appears. Verbal thought consumes mental resources, especially working memory. In situations that demand rapid response, spatial coordination, or emotional sensitivity, inner speech may be reduced or bypassed entirely. Individuals who habitually function in such environments may develop a cognitive style that prioritizes nonverbal processing, even outside those contexts. This does not eliminate inner speech, but it makes it less central. Personality-related factors have also been explored, although findings remain inconsistent and should be interpreted cautiously, unverified. Some research suggests associations between inner speech frequency and traits related to introspection or self-focus. But no stable personality profile reliably predicts the presence or absence of an inner monologue. What emerges instead is flexibility, with individuals shifting between verbal and nonverbal modes depending on context rather than remaining fixed. Language proficiency does not straightforwardly determine inner speech either. Fluency in spoken language does not guarantee frequent inner narration, and reduced inner speech does not imply difficulty with language use. Many people without a strong inner monologue speak and write fluently, constructing language externally rather than internally. This distinction reinforces the idea that inner speech is a style of processing, not a measure of verbal ability. Cultural expectations quietly shape how people interpret their inner experience. In cultures that emphasize self-reflection, explanation, and verbal articulation of thoughts, inner speech may be more readily noticed and valued. In contexts that prioritize action, observation, or collective awareness, nonverbal cognition may feel more natural and less in need of commentary. These cultural lenses influence how people describe their minds, even if the underlying cognitive processes are similar. Another factor involves how people learn to interpret mental silence. For someone accustomed to verbal narration, moments of quiet may feel like something is missing. For someone who has rarely relied on inner speech, silence feels neutral or even preferable. These interpretations affect reporting. The same internal experience may be labeled as absence, presence, or irrelevance depending on expectations rather than actual cognitive activity. Importantly, inner monologue frequency can change across the lifespan. Stress, trauma, focused training, meditation practices, or shifts in responsibility can alter how much verbal thought appears. Some people report increased inner speech during periods of anxiety or self-monitoring, while others describe reduced narration during states of absorption or expertise. These changes support the idea that inner speech is dynamic rather than fixed. The variability of inner monologues challenges the assumption that one cognitive style represents the norm. Psychology increasingly recognizes that minds solve similar problems using different internal tools. Verbal narration happens to be highly reportable and socially reinforced, which makes it feel dominant, but dominance does not equal universality. Inner silence reflects an alternative balance, not a missing component. This chapter reinforces a central theme of the series. People do not lack an inner monologue because something failed to develop correctly. Differences in experience, attention, learning, and reinforcement shape how thought is organized. Some minds narrate, some summarize, some visualize, and some simply know. All of these approaches remain valid expressions of human cognition. Understanding why inner monologues differ helps remove judgment from the discussion. Variation reflects adaptation, not deficit. The mind selects tools that work, and for many people, words are optional rather than essential. Chapter 5: Awareness, Self-Control, and the Myth of the Inner Voice. These are the ways awareness and self-regulation function without an inner monologue. And this chapter explains how people monitor themselves, control behavior, and reflect on their actions even when no internal voice is present. A common assumption about inner speech is that it acts as the manager of the mind, directing behavior, restraining impulses, and providing self-awareness through constant commentary. The premise of this chapter challenges that assumption directly. Self-control and awareness do not depend on an internal narrator, and many people regulate themselves effectively without verbal self-instruction. Psychological models of self-regulation describe control as a distributed process rather than a single command center. Attention, emotion, memory, and perception work together to guide behavior, often without conscious verbal involvement. Inner speech can participate in this process, especially in deliberate planning or moral reasoning, but it is not the sole mechanism by which regulation occurs. For individuals without an inner monologue, these systems operate through nonverbal signals that fulfill the same regulatory functions. Emotional feedback plays a primary role in self-control. Feelings of discomfort, ease, tension, or calm act as signals that guide behavior before words appear. Neuroscience research shows that emotional evaluation occurs rapidly and automatically, influencing decisions without requiring conscious narration. A person may avoid a choice because it feels wrong, or pursue one because it feels aligned, even if no sentence forms internally to explain why. Regulation happens through sensation and effect rather than instruction. Attention itself functions as a regulatory system. Where attention goes, behavior follows. For people with minimal inner speech, attention may be guided by changes in sensory input, bodily state, or environmental cues rather than verbal reminders. A shift in posture, a tightening in the chest, or a sudden awareness of time passing can prompt action or restraint without any internal command being spoken. These cues are subtle but effective, and they operate continuously. Habit formation further illustrates how control can exist without narration. Once behaviors are learned, they require little conscious oversight. Skills like driving, typing, or social etiquette often unfold automatically, guided by procedural memory rather than internal dialogue. Inner speech may be useful during early learning, but it fades as expertise develops. For people who rely less on inner narration, this transition may happen earlier or more completely, leaving control embedded in action rather than commentary. Self-monitoring is often misunderstood as verbal self-observation. In practice, monitoring frequently occurs through comparison rather than narration. People notice mismatches between expectation and outcome, between intention and result, without necessarily labeling them in words. A sense of error, friction, or misalignment arises, prompting adjustment. This process can remain entirely nonverbal while still supporting reflection and correction. Moral regulation offers another example. Ethical behavior is sometimes imagined as an internal debate conducted in sentences, weighing reasons and consequences. Research in moral psychology shows that many moral judgments occur intuitively, shaped by emotion, social learning, and context, with verbal reasoning added afterward when explanation is required. For individuals without inner speech, moral awareness may appear as immediate recognition of appropriateness or violation rather than articulated argument. The absence of narration does not imply the absence of values. Impulse control also operates through timing rather than speech. Delaying action often depends on emotional tolerance and attentional redirection, not verbal commands to wait. A person can resist an urge by shifting focus, changing posture, or disengaging from a trigger without ever saying, "Don't do this," internally. These strategies rely on embodied regulation, which functions independently of language. Reflection, often assumed to require inner dialogue, can take nonverbal forms as well. Instead of replaying events in words, reflection may involve revisiting images, bodily sensations, or emotional patterns associated with an experience. Insight can emerge through pattern recognition, noticing similarities across situations, or sensing long-term trends. The understanding is real even if it is difficult to verbalize until communication becomes necessary. Psychological studies on mindfulness and attention provide indirect support for this view. Practices that reduce verbal thought do not eliminate awareness or self-control. In many cases, reduced inner speech corresponds with increased sensitivity to bodily and emotional cues. Although individual experiences vary, and findings should not be generalized too broadly, unverified. These observations reinforce the idea that narration is not required for regulation. The belief that inner speech is necessary for self-control may stem from how self-regulation is taught. Children are often instructed verbally, encouraged to talk through problems, and praised for explaining their reasoning. These practices strengthen the link between words and control for some individuals. Others internalize control through observation, imitation, and emotional feedback, developing regulatory systems that rely less on verbalization. Stress reveals how flexible regulation can be. Under high stress, inner speech often becomes fragmented, repetitive, or intrusive. Yet behavior does not necessarily collapse. People continue to act, respond, and adapt even when internal narration is chaotic or absent. This resilience suggests that control is supported by deeper systems that do not depend on coherent internal dialogue. Importantly, the absence of an inner monologue does not mean the absence of self-awareness. Awareness can exist as a continuous sense of state rather than a commentary on that state. A person can know they are tired, overwhelmed, focused, or satisfied without internally stating those facts. This form of awareness is immediate rather than descriptive, grounded in experience rather than explanation. Social behavior further demonstrates this point. Conversations require real-time adjustment to tone, facial expression, and context. Inner narration would often be too slow to guide these interactions effectively. Instead, social regulation relies on perception and emotional resonance. People without inner monologues participate in social life competently because regulation is embedded in responsiveness, not speech. One reason inner speech feels indispensable to those who experience it frequently is that it is highly noticeable. Silence, by contrast, draws attention only when someone expects words to be there. This difference in salience can create the illusion that narration equals control, when in reality, narration is simply one visible layer of a much larger regulatory system. Psychology does not support the idea that removing inner speech removes agency. Agency arises from the ability to select actions, evaluate outcomes, and adjust behavior, all of which can occur non-verbally. The mechanisms differ in format, not function. Control without words is still control. This chapter addresses one of the most persistent fears surrounding internal silence. The fear is not that thinking stops, but that the self disappears without narration. Evidence suggests otherwise. The self is maintained through continuity of perception, memory, emotion, and action, not through a running commentary. Understanding self-regulation without inner speech helps dismantle the myth that the inner voice is the mind's supervisor. Words can assist, clarify, and rehearse, but they are not the foundation of control. Many people live with quiet minds that remain organized, reflective, and disciplined through systems that operate beneath and beyond language. This chapter reinforces the broader argument of the series. Inner monologue is one tool among many. Awareness, control, and responsibility do not depend on hearing oneself think. They depend on the brain's ability to integrate information and guide behavior, a capacity that remains fully intact whether thoughts arrive as sentences or as silence. Chapter 6. Memory, learning, and intelligence without inner speech. These are the ways memory formation, learning, and intellectual performance function without an inner monologue. And this chapter explains how people acquire knowledge, retain information, and demonstrate intelligence even when thought is not verbally narrated. One of the strongest assumptions about inner speech is that it is necessary for learning and memory. Many people believe that remembering requires repeating words internally, and that understanding depends on talking ideas through in the mind. The premise of this chapter challenges that belief directly. Memory and learning do not rely on inner narration, and intelligence does not require verbal rehearsal to function effectively. Psychological research distinguishes between multiple memory systems, and none of them require inner speech by definition. Working memory, long-term memory, procedural memory, and episodic memory operate through different mechanisms. Verbal rehearsal is one strategy for maintaining information in working memory, but it is not the only one. Visual, spatial, emotional, and motor-based representations can serve the same function without words. Visual memory provides a clear example. Many individuals remember information as images, layouts, or scenes rather than sentences. A concept may be stored as a diagram-like structure, where relationships matter more than labels. When recall occurs, the image reappears, and details are accessed through inspection rather than verbal repetition. This process allows complex information to be retained without ever being translated into language. Spatial memory works similarly. Routes, sequences, and systems can be remembered as paths or configurations rather than verbal lists. Someone may know how to navigate a process or environment without being able to describe it step by step in words. The knowledge exists as orientation and movement rather than narration. This form of memory is common in skilled navigation, technical work, and physical tasks, where explanation often lags behind execution. Procedural memory further undermines the idea that words are central to learning. Skills such as playing an instrument, performing surgery, or mastering a sport are acquired through repetition and feedback, not through internal dialogue. Early stages may involve verbal instruction, but expertise develops when control shifts to automatic systems. For individuals with minimal inner speech, this transition may feel more natural, with learning embedded directly in action. Episodic memory also does not depend on narration. Remembering an event often involves reconstructing sensory and emotional details rather than replaying a verbal account. A memory may surface as a visual scene, a bodily sensation, or a mood shift, with words added only when communication is required. People without inner monologues still recall experiences vividly, even if they do not internally tell themselves the story of what happened. Semantic memory, which stores facts and concepts, is frequently mistaken for verbal storage. While facts are often taught verbally, the brain does not store them as sentences. Knowledge is encoded as networks of meaning and association. Understanding a concept means knowing how it relates to other concepts, how it behaves, and how it can be applied. Words act as access points, not containers. This is why people can understand ideas they struggle to explain. Learning without inner speech often emphasizes pattern recognition. Instead of verbally rehearsing rules, individuals may notice regularities across examples and extract structure implicitly. This form of learning is well documented in psychology, especially in language acquisition, motor learning, and category formation. People can learn complex systems without being able to articulate the rules governing them, which demonstrates that learning can occur below the level of verbal awareness. Intelligence tests themselves reveal the limits of equating intelligence with inner speech. Many measures of reasoning, such as matrix problems or spatial puzzles, are designed specifically to minimize verbal demands. Performance on these tasks shows that reasoning can occur through visual transformation and relational comparison without narration. Individuals with quiet minds often perform normally or exceptionally on such tasks, contradicting the idea that words drive intelligence. Problem solving without inner speech often feels immediate rather than stepwise. Instead of constructing a verbal chain of logic, a solution may appear as a recognition of fit or coherence. The reasoning still exists, but it unfolds through comparison and alignment rather than explicit explanation. This can make problem-solving faster in some contexts, while making verbal explanation afterward more effortful. Educational systems sometimes mistake explanation for understanding. Students are often asked to show their work verbally or narrate their reasoning, which can disadvantage those who arrive at answers non-verbally. The difficulty lies not in understanding the material, but in translating understanding into words. This translation step can obscure true competence, especially when verbal articulation is treated as evidence of intelligence rather than as a separate skill. Memory strategies also differ across individuals. Some people rely heavily on verbal rehearsal, repeating information internally to keep it active. Others rely on imagery, association, or emotional tagging. For someone without an inner monologue, verbal rehearsal may feel inefficient or unnatural. leading them to develop alternative strategies that suit their cognitive style. These strategies are no less effective, but they are less visible in word-centered environments. Forgetting is often misattributed to a lack of internal repetition. In reality, memory strength depends on depth of processing and relevance, not on narration alone. Information connected to meaningful patterns, emotions, or goals tends to be retained regardless of whether it was verbally rehearsed. Silent learners often remember what matters without needing to repeat it internally, because encoding occurs through integration rather than repetition. The role of language in learning is often external rather than internal. Teachers, books, and conversations provide verbal structure, but internal processing does not have to mirror that structure. A person can absorb spoken or written information and reorganize it non-verbally. Words enter through perception and leave through understanding, without lingering as an internal voice. Misconceptions arise when people equate the absence of inner speech with shallow processing. Depth of processing refers to how richly information is connected, not how verbally it is handled. A quiet mind can form dense networks of association without narration. In some cases, verbalization can even interfere with learning by forcing linear explanation onto information better handled holistically. Research on expertise supports this view. Experts often report that their thinking becomes less verbal over time. As knowledge consolidates, actions and judgments become intuitive and pattern-based. Words are reserved for teaching or reflection, not for moment-to-moment cognition. This shift does not reduce intelligence. It reflects efficiency. Importantly, none of this implies that inner speech is useless for learning. Verbal rehearsal can support memorization, planning, and self-explanation, especially in early stages of learning. The key point is that it is optional, not mandatory. Different minds achieve learning through different internal routes, all supported by the brain's capacity to represent information in multiple formats. This chapter dismantles another common fear associated with internal silence. The fear is that without words, knowledge cannot accumulate or be retained. Evidence suggests the opposite. Memory and learning depend on structure, relevance, and integration, not on internal narration. Understanding intelligence without inner speech helps clarify a broader truth. Intelligence is not defined by how thoughts sound, but by how effectively information is used. Quiet minds learn, remember, and reason through systems that operate beneath language, producing understanding without commentary. This chapter reinforces the series' central claim. Inner monologue is one way knowledge can be handled, not the measure of intellectual depth. Memory does not require repetition in words. Learning does not require explanation in sentences. And intelligence does not depend on hearing oneself think. Human cognition is flexible enough to support all of these processes in silence. Chapter 7: Emotional Regulation and Mental Health Without an Inner Voice. This chapter explores how emotions are experienced, regulated, and understood when there is little or no inner monologue, and what this reveals about the relationship between language, mood, and psychological well-being. A common assumption is that emotional regulation depends on inner speech. People often describe calming themselves down by talking internally, reframing situations with words, or reasoning their way out of distress. From this perspective, an inner voice appears essential for managing feelings, maintaining stability, and making sense of emotional life. Yet psychological evidence suggests that emotions do not originate in language, and regulation does not require verbal narration to function effectively. Emotions emerge from fast, automatic systems that evaluate relevance and threat long before conscious thought appears. Fear, joy, anger, and sadness arise through physiological and neural processes that operate independently of words. The body reacts, the nervous system adjusts, and subjective feeling follows. Inner speech may comment on these changes, but it does not create them. For people without an inner monologue, emotional experience unfolds directly, without a verbal layer interpreting it in real time. This directness can shape emotional awareness in distinctive ways. Instead of labeling feelings internally, individuals may notice shifts in bodily sensation, energy, or attention. A sense of unease may be felt as tension rather than named as anxiety. Calm may be experienced as physical openness rather than described as relief. Emotional information is still present, but it arrives through sensation and intuition rather than narration. One concern often raised is whether the absence of inner speech impairs emotional regulation. Regulation is frequently imagined as a verbal process, reminding oneself to stay calm, challenging negative thoughts, or offering internal reassurance. However, research on emotion regulation identifies multiple nonverbal strategies. These include attentional control, behavioral adjustment, physiological modulation, and environmental change. None of these require internal dialogue. Attention plays a central role. Shifting focus away from distressing stimuli reduces emotional intensity regardless of verbal involvement. Someone may calm down by engaging in movement, sensory input, or purposeful action. These strategies operate through neural mechanisms that downregulate emotional circuits without requiring explanation or commentary. For quiet minds, regulation often occurs through doing rather than telling. Physiological regulation further illustrates this point. Breathing patterns, posture, and muscle tension directly influence emotional state. Slow breathing reduces arousal, relaxed posture signals safety, and physical grounding stabilizes mood. These processes function automatically once learned. While instructions may be taught verbally, execution does not require inner speech. Many people regulate emotions through embodied habits rather than internal conversation. The role of inner speech becomes more ambiguous when examining mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression. Numerous studies associate these conditions with repetitive negative verbal thought, often called rumination. Rumination involves cycling through worries, self-criticism, and imagined outcomes in verbal form. This pattern intensifies distress by repeatedly activating emotional responses without resolution. Individuals with minimal inner speech may be less prone to verbal rumination. Without an internal narrator rehearsing worries, emotional states may pass more quickly once the triggering situation ends. This does not mean distress is absent, but it may be less prolonged. Some researchers speculate that reduced verbal rumination could be protective against certain forms of anxiety and depression, unverified. However, the absence of inner speech does not guarantee emotional well-being. Emotional regulation depends on many factors, including temperament, life circumstances, social support, and learned coping strategies. Quiet minds still experience stress, grief, and fear. The difference lies in how these states are processed. Instead of being amplified by internal commentary, emotions may be processed through sensation, behavior, or action. Emotional understanding also does not require constant labeling. While language can help categorize and communicate feelings, awareness can exist without words. Infants and animals experience emotions without naming them, responding adaptively through behavior. Adults without inner speech may retain this more direct mode of emotional knowing, relying on felt sense rather than verbal analysis. Problems can arise when external environments demand verbal articulation of internal states. Therapy, education, and social interactions often prioritize emotional labeling and verbal reflection. Individuals who process emotions non-verbally may struggle to describe what they feel, even when they understand it internally. This gap can be misinterpreted as emotional unawareness rather than as a difference in processing style. Clinical psychology sometimes equates insight with verbalization. Gaining insight is often framed as recognizing patterns and naming them internally. Yet insight can also emerge as recognition without words, a shift in perception or behavior that reflects understanding. People may change how they act long before they can explain why. This suggests that therapeutic change does not always require verbal insight to occur. The relationship between inner speech and self-compassion is similarly complex. Self-compassion practices often involve speaking kindly to oneself internally. For those without inner speech, compassion may be enacted through gentler behavior, reduced self-punishment, or intuitive care rather than verbal reassurance. Compassion can be embodied rather than narrated. Interestingly, mindfulness and meditation research provides insight into this dynamic. Many contemplative practices aim to reduce verbal thought, encouraging awareness without commentary. Practitioners report that reducing inner speech often leads to greater emotional clarity and stability. This suggests that silence is not inherently dysregulating, and may even support emotional balance for some individuals. Emotional memory also differs without narration. Traumatic or distressing experiences are often reinforced by verbal replay. Repeatedly telling oneself what happened can strengthen emotional associations. Without internal replay, emotional memories may fade more naturally, though this varies widely. Conversely, some individuals may struggle to integrate emotional experiences without verbal meaning-making, relying instead on external discussion to process events. Social emotion regulation remains essential. Even without inner speech, people regulate emotions through interaction. Talking to others, observing social cues, and receiving feedback help contextualize feelings. Language may be external rather than internal, serving as a shared tool for emotional understanding rather than a private one. A critical point is that mental health frameworks often assume a verbally mediated mind. Diagnostic criteria, therapeutic techniques, and self-help models are built around thoughts as sentences. This can marginalize those whose distress does not present verbally. Recognizing non-verbal emotional processing expands the definition of psychological health and avoids mistaking difference for dysfunction. There is also evidence that excessive inner speech can worsen emotional distress. Overanalysis, self-judgment, and anticipatory worry often take verbal form. In this sense, silence can be a relief rather than a deficit. A quieter mind may experience emotions more cleanly, without the secondary layer of commentary that complicates feeling. This does not imply that inner speech causes mental illness, nor that its absence prevents it. The relationship is bidirectional and context-dependent. Inner speech can support regulation when used constructively, and it can undermine it when dominated by negativity. Likewise, silence can be stabilizing or disorienting, depending on the individual and situation. The key conclusion of this chapter is that emotional health does not depend on hearing oneself think. Regulation occurs through multiple systems, many of which operate independently of language. Emotional awareness does not require narration, and well-being does not require constant internal dialogue. Understanding this helps dismantle a subtle bias in how minds are evaluated. Quiet minds are not emotionally underdeveloped. They are organized differently, relying on embodied, perceptual, and intuitive processes rather than verbal mediation. Their emotional lives are no less real, no less complex, and no less human. This chapter reinforces a broader theme. Language is one interface with emotion, not the source of it. Mental health depends on flexibility, responsiveness, and integration, not on how much internal speech accompanies feeling. Silence inside the mind is not emotional emptiness. It is simply another way emotional life can be lived. Chapter 8. Learning, Intelligence, and Thinking Without Words. This chapter examines how learning, reasoning, and intelligence function in minds that operate with little or no inner monologue, and what this reveals about the nature of thinking itself. A widespread belief equates intelligence with verbal reasoning. People often describe thinking as talking things through internally, weighing options in words, or explaining ideas to themselves step by step. From this viewpoint, an inner monologue seems inseparable from analysis, learning, and problem solving. Yet decades of cognitive research show that human intelligence is not a single verbal process, but a collection of systems that often operate without language at all. Learning begins long before words are available. Infants learn patterns, predict outcomes, and recognize cause and effect months before language development. They distinguish faces, track objects, and adapt behavior through experience alone. These early capacities do not disappear when language emerges. They remain active throughout adulthood, supporting reasoning that does not rely on internal narration. For individuals without an inner monologue, learning often occurs through pattern recognition rather than verbal explanation. Information is absorbed as structure, relationship, or spatial arrangement instead of as sentences. A concept may be understood as a configuration rather than as a definition. This allows comprehension to arise quickly, sometimes without the person being able to immediately explain how they know what they know. This style of cognition is especially visible in visual and spatial reasoning. Tasks involving geometry, navigation, mechanics, or systems thinking often rely on mental simulation rather than verbal rehearsal. Engineers, architects, designers, and mechanics frequently report thinking in diagrams, motion, or force rather than in words. The absence of inner speech does not hinder this process, and may even remove friction created by translation into language. Problem solving illustrates this distinction clearly. Verbal problem solving involves articulating steps internally, evaluating each move through language. Nonverbal problem solving relies on trial, simulation, and intuitive adjustment. Both approaches reach solutions, but they travel different cognitive paths. In some cases, nonverbal reasoning can be faster because it bypasses explanation and moves directly to resolution. Mathematical thinking provides a strong example. While math is often taught verbally, advanced mathematical reasoning frequently becomes nonverbal. Experienced mathematicians report seeing relationships, symmetries, and transformations without verbalizing them. Numbers become shapes, operations become movements, and proofs unfold visually. Inner speech may be used for communication, but not for the core reasoning itself. Memory formation also differs without constant verbal encoding. Verbal learners often remember information by rehearsing it internally, strengthening recall through repetition. Nonverbal learners rely more on association, imagery, or contextual embedding. A fact may be remembered because of where it fits within a mental structure, rather than because it was repeated as a phrase. This difference becomes apparent in educational settings. Traditional schooling privileges verbal processing, rewarding students who can explain reasoning step by step in words. Students who think non-verbally may understand material deeply while struggling to articulate it under verbal constraints. Their intelligence can be underestimated, not because it is weaker, but because it is expressed differently. Reading offers another insight. Many people report hearing words in their head as they read, while others do not. Silent readers without inner speech often process text as meaning walk rather than sound. Sentences are understood as units of information, not as spoken language. This can lead to faster reading speeds and efficient comprehension, especially for technical or informational material. However, this efficiency can come with trade-offs. Verbal rehearsal supports certain types of memory, particularly sequential recall. Without inner speech, remembering exact phrasing, lists, or ordered instructions may require external aids. This does not reflect lower intelligence, but a different allocation of cognitive resources. Intelligence testing itself reveals biases toward verbal cognition. Many standardized tests measure verbal reasoning, vocabulary, and linguistic manipulation. While these are valid cognitive skills, they do not encompass the full range of human intelligence. Nonverbal reasoning tests often reveal strengths in individuals who score lower on verbal measures, highlighting the limits of language-based assessment. Creativity further challenges the assumption that thought requires words. Creative insight often arrives suddenly, without explanation. Artists, musicians, and inventors frequently describe knowing what they want before they can describe it. The idea appears as a feeling, an image, or a sense of correctness. Words come later, if they come at all. For people without inner monologue, creativity may feel more continuous rather than episodic. Ideas evolve through manipulation rather than debate. Instead of arguing internally about options, possibilities are tested through mental simulation or external experimentation. This can result in a fluid creative process that feels less constrained by self-criticism. Self-criticism itself is closely tied to verbal thought. Inner speech enables evaluation, comparison, and judgment. Without it, performance anxiety and doubt may manifest differently or less persistently. This does not eliminate insecurity, but it changes its form. Feedback may be felt as discomfort, rather than heard as accusation. Decision-making also adapts. Verbal decision-making often involves listing pros and cons internally. Nonverbal decision-making relies on weighing impressions, emotional signals, and anticipated outcomes without verbal articulation. Neuroscience research shows that emotional and intuitive systems play a critical role in decision-making, even in verbally oriented individuals, suggesting that nonverbal decision-making is not inferior, only less explicit. One misconception is that people without inner speech lack self-awareness. In reality, self-awareness does not require narration. Awareness can arise as monitoring rather than commentary. Actions are noticed, intentions are sensed, and errors are corrected without explanation. This form of awareness resembles skilled physical performance, where adjustment occurs without verbal instruction. Learning from mistakes follows a similar pattern. Instead of internally stating what went wrong, correction occurs through recalibration. The body and mind adjust behavior based on outcome. This process is efficient and often more accurate than verbal reasoning, which can overgeneralize or misattribute causes. The social implications of nonverbal intelligence are significant. In group discussions, those who think silently may need more time to translate understanding into words. Their contributions may arrive later, but often integrate information more holistically. Environments that reward speed over depth may disadvantage them. Importantly, none of this suggests that inner speech is unnecessary or harmful. Verbal reasoning enables planning, abstraction, and communication at a level unmatched by other species. The point is that it is not the sole medium of thought. Intelligence is distributed across systems, many of which function quietly. Understanding this reshapes how intelligence is defined. Intelligence is not how clearly you can hear yourself think, but how effectively your mind adapts, solves problems, and learns from experience. Words are tools, not prerequisites. This chapter highlights a recurring theme. The absence of inner monologue does not represent a cognitive deficit. It represents a different balance between verbal and nonverbal systems. These minds are not empty. They are structured differently, often operating beneath the level of language. Recognizing this diversity matters. It affects education, assessment, workplace expectations, and self-understanding. When intelligence is measured only through words, entire forms of cognition remain invisible. Thinking does not begin with language, and it does not end with it. For many people, thought flows through patterns, sensations, and intuitions that never become sentences. These thoughts still reason, still learn, and still understand. Silence in the mind is not absence of intelligence. It is intelligence expressed without narration. Chapter 9. Consciousness without narration. This chapter examines what consciousness looks like when it unfolds without a running internal narrator, and what this reveals about awareness, selfhood, and the structure of subjective experience. For many people, consciousness feels inseparable from language. Awareness seems to arrive wrapped in sentences, accompanied by commentary that explains what is happening, what it means, and what should happen next. This creates the impression that consciousness itself is verbal, that to be aware is to be narrating experience in real time. Yet psychological and philosophical research suggests that narration is only one way consciousness can organize itself, not the foundation on which awareness depends. Consciousness, at its core, is the presence of experience. Sensations arise, perceptions form, emotions shift, and attention moves, whether or not these events are described internally. Vision does not require commentary to occur. Pain does not require a sentence to be felt. Balance, movement, and emotion operate continuously beneath language. Inner speech may annotate these processes, but it does not generate them. Individuals without an inner monologue often describe consciousness as immediate rather than reflective. Experience happens first, without being translated into words. Awareness feels closer to perception than to description. Instead of thinking about what they are seeing, they simply see. Instead of narrating what they feel it. Meaning is present, but it is not spelled out internally. This challenges a common assumption that self-awareness requires self-talk. Awareness of oneself can exist without describing oneself. A person can know they are angry without saying, I'm angry internally. They can recognize intention, error, or desire through felt signals rather than verbal identification. This form of self-awareness resembles skilled action, where monitoring and correction occur without conscious instruction. Philosophers have long distinguished between reflective consciousness and pre-reflective consciousness. Reflective consciousness involves thinking about experience, often through language. Pre-reflective consciousness is the direct awareness of experience as it unfolds. Quiet minds operate primarily in this pre-reflective mode. They are conscious without standing back to comment on consciousness itself. This distinction becomes clear during activities that demand full attention. When someone is absorbed in sports, music, or physical craft, inner speech often fades even in verbally oriented individuals. Performance improves as narration drops away. Actions flow smoothly, guided by perception and feedback rather than instruction. This suggests that narration is not required for effective awareness and may sometimes interfere with it. Without narration, the sense of self can feel less rigid. The self is not constantly reasserted through language. There is less internal emphasis on I, me, and mine. Experience feels more continuous with the environment, less divided into observer and observed. This does not erase individuality, but it can soften the boundaries created by constant self-reference. Some people interpret this as a lack of identity, but research does not support that conclusion. Identity does not require narration to exist. Preferences, values, memories, and goals remain intact. They are accessed through recognition rather than rehearsal. The self is known implicitly through patterns of response rather than explicitly through description. Time perception also shifts without narration. Inner speech structures experience into sequences, marking before and after through language. Without it, time may feel less segmented. Moments blend more smoothly, with fewer mental bookmarks. This can make time feel faster or slower depending on context, but often more fluid. This fluidity can be beneficial. Excessive narration often pulls attention away from the present, anchoring awareness in memory or anticipation. Quiet consciousness remains closer to what is actually happening. Sensory detail becomes more prominent. Emotional shifts are noticed earlier, before they are elaborated into stories. However, narration serves functions that silence does not automatically replace. Language enables abstract reflection, long-term planning, and explicit reasoning. Without internal narration, these processes may rely more heavily on external tools such as writing, diagrams, or spoken discussion. Consciousness remains intact, but its organization shifts outward rather than inward. Memory consolidation offers another lens. Narrated experiences are often remembered as stories. Events are encoded with context, explanation, and interpretation. Non-narrated experiences may be remembered as impressions, scenes, or emotional residues. These memories are no less real, but they may be harder to translate into words later. This translation gap can create misunderstanding. When asked to describe their inner life, individuals without narration may struggle to articulate something that never took verbal form. Observers may mistake this difficulty for lack of awareness, when it actually reflects a mismatch between experience and language. Meditative traditions have explored this territory for centuries. Many practices aim to quiet internal narration, not to eliminate consciousness, but to reveal what remains when commentary stops. Practitioners often report that awareness becomes clearer, more stable, and less reactive. This supports the idea that narration is not consciousness itself, but one layer added on top of it. Neuroscientific research aligns with this view. Brain activity associated with inner speech overlaps with language networks, not with the systems that generate perception or emotion. When inner speech decreases, these other systems continue to function normally. Consciousness does not shut down when narration fades. It reorganizes. Importantly, the absence of narration does not mean the absence of meaning. Meaning can be felt rather than stated. A situation can make sense without being explained internally. Recognition, familiarity, and understanding often operate below language. Words make meaning explicit, but they do not create it from nothing. This has implications for how consciousness is defined. If awareness can exist without narration, then language cannot be its foundation. Consciousness must be more basic than speech, arising from perception, integration, and attention rather than from words. Language becomes a tool consciousness uses, not the medium it requires. The experience of agency also changes. Narrated consciousness often includes commentary on action, explaining why something is being done. Without narration, action may feel more automatic, yet still intentional. Decisions are made, goals are pursued, and corrections occur without verbal justification. Agency is felt as movement toward an outcome rather than as a spoken plan. This does not imply passivity. Quiet consciousness can be highly deliberate. Deliberation simply occurs through evaluation of possibilities rather than internal debate. Options are sensed, weighed, and selected without being argued aloud in the mind. A potential downside is reduced access to metacognition, the ability to think about thinking. Language facilitates explicit reflection on mental processes. Without it, recognizing patterns in one's own behavior may require external reflection. Journaling, discussion, or therapy can serve this role, making implicit processes visible through interaction rather than introspection. Still, many people report a sense of ease in non-narrated consciousness. Without constant commentary, there is less friction, less judgment, and less internal noise. Experience feels cleaner. Attention moves naturally rather than being pulled by verbal loops. This ease is not universal, nor is it inherently superior. Consciousness expresses itself in multiple valid forms. Narrated minds and quiet minds each have strengths and vulnerabilities. The mistake lies in assuming that one form defines consciousness itself. This chapter reinforces a central point. Consciousness does not require a voice. Awareness does not depend on sentences. The mind can know without speaking, recognize without naming, and understand without explaining. Narration is one way consciousness organizes experience, not the way it must. When narration is absent or minimal, consciousness does not vanish. It becomes simpler, more immediate, and often more grounded in perception. Understanding this expands how we think about the mind. It invites respect for cognitive diversity and challenges. The assumption that inner speech defines what it means to be aware. Consciousness is broader than language, deeper than narration, and far more flexible than our intuitions suggest. Chapter 10. What changes when the voice is absent? This chapter explains how daily life, emotional regulation, relationships, and self-control change when inner monologue is minimal or absent, and what patterns consistently appear across people who think without a running internal voice. When inner monologue is absent, daily experience does not become empty or unclear. What changes is the medium through which experience is processed. Instead of being filtered through words, events are handled through sensation, recognition, and response. Life still unfolds moment by moment, but without constant verbal labeling of what is happening or why it matters. One of the most noticeable differences appears in emotional processing. Verbal minds often narrate emotion as it arises, naming it, judging it, and linking it to memories or predictions. Anger becomes a story, fear becomes an argument, sadness becomes an explanation. Without inner speech, emotion is felt more directly. Signals arrive as bodily sensation, tension, energy, or withdrawal rather than as sentences. This directness can change how long emotions last. Narration tends to prolong feeling by replaying it. A single moment can expand into minutes or hours through internal commentary. Quiet minds often experience emotions intensely but briefly. Once the stimulus passes, the emotion dissipates more quickly because it is not verbally rehearsed. This does not mean emotional suppression. The emotion is fully present. It simply does not echo. Regulation occurs through physiological settling rather than cognitive debate. The body calms, attention shifts, and the emotional state resolves without explanation. Stress follows a similar pattern. Verbal stress often comes from anticipation and rumination. Inner speech projects future scenarios, evaluates risks, and revisits past mistakes. Without narration, stress is more closely tied to immediate conditions. Pressure rises when something is happening, then falls when it ends. Chronic stress driven by repetitive thought loops is less common, though situational stress remains real. Decision-making also feels different. In narrated minds, choices are weighed through internal dialogue, comparing options explicitly. In quiet minds, decisions emerge from alignment rather than argument. One option feels workable, another does not. This evaluation happens through pattern recognition, emotional resonance, and past experience rather than verbal reasoning. Because of this, decisions may appear impulsive from the outside. From the inside, they feel settled. The reasoning exists, but it is implicit. When asked to explain a choice, the person may struggle to articulate a process that never took verbal form. This can be misinterpreted as carelessness, when it actually reflects a different decision pathway. Self-control is often assumed to rely on self-talk. Phrases like, "don't do that," or "stay focused," are treated as internal commands. Yet self-control can operate through habit, environment, and embodied awareness. Quiet minds often regulate behavior by avoiding triggering contexts, noticing early signals, or relying on routine rather than verbal discipline. For example, focus may be maintained through physical cues such as posture, breathing, or movement instead of internal reminders. Distraction is noticed as a shift in sensation rather than as a thought that says, "I'm distracted." Correction happens automatically, without commentary. Social interaction highlights another shift. Many people rehearse conversations internally, predicting responses and editing their words before speaking. Without inner monologue, conversation is more reactive and present-focused. Words are chosen in real time. Listening becomes more immersive because attention is not split between the speaker and internal commentary. This can create a sense of authenticity. Responses feel immediate rather than calculated. However, it can also make certain social situations harder, especially those that benefit from planning or diplomacy. Without rehearsal, responses may be blunt or incomplete. Social learning still occurs, but adjustment relies more on feedback than on internal scripting. Empathy is not reduced. In fact, some people report heightened sensitivity to emotional cues because attention is not occupied by self-talk. Facial expression, tone, and body language stand out more clearly. Understanding others becomes a matter of sensing rather than analyzing. Memory in daily life shows distinct patterns. Without narration, experiences are encoded as scenes, feelings, or relational snapshots. A day is remembered as a sequence of impressions rather than a narrated story. This can make recall vivid but non-linear. Details emerge when prompted by context rather than through deliberate retrieval. Autobiographical memory may feel less story-like. Life is known through accumulation rather than narrative. Identity is felt as continuity of response rather than as a personal storyline told internally. This does not weaken identity, but it changes how it is accessed. Motivation also shifts. Verbal motivation often involves self-encouragement or pressure through language. Quiet motivation arises from momentum and alignment. When an activity fits, engagement follows naturally. When it does not, resistance appears as heaviness or avoidance rather than as internal complaint. This can make external structure more important. Schedules, routines, and physical cues help guide action when internal narration is not used for planning. Many people without inner monologue rely heavily on written lists, calendars, or visual reminders. These tools externalize what narration handles internally for others. Creativity in daily life often feels more fluid. Without verbal judgment interrupting the process, experimentation flows more easily. Ideas are tested through action rather than debated internally. Mistakes are adjusted rather than criticized. This can reduce creative paralysis and increase output, especially in hands-on or visual domains. At the same time, reflection requires intention. Verbal minds reflect automatically through self-talk. Quiet minds may need deliberate reflection through writing or discussion. Insight arrives when experience is translated into language externally, not internally. This makes reflection slower, but often more grounded. Sleep and rest can also differ. Inner monologue is a common driver of insomnia, replaying concerns and unfinished thoughts. Without it, falling asleep may be easier, though not guaranteed. Physical discomfort and emotional arousal still affect rest, but verbal loops are less likely to keep the mind active. One area where challenges can arise is planning far into the future. Long-term goals benefit from abstraction and verbal modeling. Without internal narration, future planning may feel vague unless supported by visual frameworks or written plans. This is not an inability, but a preference for externalization. Misunderstanding from others remains a recurring issue. Quiet thinkers are often assumed to be disengaged, slow, or lacking insight because their thinking is not visible. In reality, much of their processing happens beneath the surface. When given time or the right medium, their understanding becomes clear. Importantly, none of these differences imply superiority or deficiency. They describe trade-offs. Narrated minds gain explicit reasoning and reflection at the cost of noise and rumination. Quiet minds gain immediacy and emotional efficiency at the cost of verbal accessibility. The absence of inner monologue reshapes daily life, but it does not reduce its depth. Experience remains rich, meaningful, and intentional. What changes is the route through which meaning is processed. This chapter completes the arc of the series. Inner monologue is not a requirement for intelligence, emotion, awareness, or control. It is one cognitive style among many. When the voice is absent, the mind does not fall silent. It listens differently. Understanding this allows for a broader definition of what it means to think. Thought does not need to speak to exist. Sometimes, it simply moves.